All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to move on to chapter 2. And in this chapter, we're going to take a little bit of a detour from talking about the subconscious mind and metaphysics. And we're really just going to talk about philosophy, right? So we're going to kind of stick to philosophical ideas in the context of philosophy. And the main topic of that philosophy is going to be God. All right, so what I want to do this chapter is I'm going to present arguments that make the case for God, right? So that's the title of the chapter. So I want to make arguments for God's existence. And I'm probably mostly going to be doing that by deconstructing or countering counter-arguments for God's existence, right? So I'm going to show why the common arguments for the common arguments that say God doesn't exist, I'm going to show why those arguments don't make any sense, at least to me. Right, so that's mainly the purpose of this chapter. Before getting into it, I just want to mention that if the environment looks a little bit different, it's actually because I changed locations from where I'm recording. I don't officially do it until probably like the middle of chapter 7. I should mention I actually already finished all the recordings already, so I recorded all those videos. But when I was going back through the recordings and I got to this chapter, I was thinking to myself, like, it was okay, the way I recorded it, but I felt like I could make it a little bit stronger, so I can make a little bit of an even stronger case for God than what I did. And that's because my ideas kind of expanded. Like I said, I'm always making theory, right? So my ideas expanded a little bit more since then. So I was like, you know what? I'll just re-record the whole chapter. So you'll notice next chapter, it goes back to the old recording location, because that one was okay. Not that any of this is super important, but I just wanted to mention it. When you get to chapter 7, I'll make a comment about the new location. You could just disregard it because you've already seen it now, so it's not important. But yeah, so I just wanted to get that out there. So to get into it, like I said, this chapter is going to be about arguments that make the case for God's existence. So I want to give a little bit of background on why I even felt the need to make the chapter. So the first thing is probably is most obvious, right? The first and most important thing, or motivation, is that I want everybody to know God, right? I want everyone to know Him and to have a relationship with Him, and really to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, right? Now, not everybody's Christian. I'm a Christian, so I believe that the highest sort of goal for everyone, and the furthest you can go with God, is really through in terms of your relationship with Jesus, right? So that's what I want for everybody. And the main way I want to help people do it, or I think I'm helping people do that, is actually with the recordings later. So pretty much the rest of the book and all the recordings after this chapter are going to teach you how to know God and how to have a relationship with Him and how to speak to Him, how to hear from Him when He speaks back to you, and how to really understand Him more deeply, right? So that's the tools after this chapter are mainly going to be how I hope to help you to know God. But I still wanted to make a chapter even outside of that. So that's the bulk of it, but even outside of that, I wanted to make a chapter really just based on arguments, intellectual or rationalist arguments. Rationalism is basically a term in philosophy, which kind of just means someone who, or rationalist, would just be someone who believes you can obtain information or obtain knowledge about reality solely through what you might think of as airtight arguments, right? So if your argument is strong enough or sound enough, then it generally is going to reflect, it's possible for it to reflect truths about reality without actually having certain experiences or experiencing reality enough to sort of recognize that truth based on the experience alone. That's kind of a really long-winded way of putting it, but you can look it up. It's a term in philosophy, but it's not super important for this video. So I just want people to be able to kind of approach God or have a kind of foundation in their belief in God based purely on kind of just arguments, right? Arguments for God's existence. Because I really think, like I said, the core of it is really going to be what I teach you later. You might not even need any of this once you really understand how to have a relationship with God based on all that. But still, like I said, I still want you to have even this on top of that, this kind of core for your foundation for accepting God. So, for me, before I say that, what we're going to do is I'm going to present, like I said, a lot of the counter-arguments, what I think are the most common counter-arguments against God's existence. And I'm going to kind of break them down, and I'm going to show why I think they don't make any sense. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about this chapter is fallacies, right? So I'm going to present a lot of arguments, which I call this fallacy, and that fallacy, and that fallacy, right? So that's just kind of how it ended up when I wrote the chapter. So I'll kind of continue in that vein a little bit in this chapter. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to imagine that I'm talking to someone who doesn't believe in God, right? So basically an atheist, right? So I'm going to think of a lot of the most common arguments that an atheist might give for why God doesn't exist. Now, to be clear, there are two kinds of atheists, is my understanding, right? So there's what you might call a soft atheist or a weak atheist, and that would be an atheist who doesn't really believe you can have any beliefs about God. So if you ask them, they would say, I have no beliefs about God. I'm not necessarily asserting the claim God doesn't exist. I just don't think you can know anything about God, so I don't have any beliefs about him. Which that's not really possible. You have to have some belief about him. It's kind of like a mental gymnastic trick they do, right? No, you have some beliefs about God, right? But still, there's those kinds, right? And then the other kinds, which you might call a hard atheist or a strong atheist. Now that would be an atheist who would claim to have done a lot of research, right? They looked into it, they thought about it a lot. That's not always the case with a weak atheist, but they've done the research, they've analyzed it, they looked deeply into it, and they're basically asserting the claim that there's no God, right? So they assert there isn't a God, and a proof demonstrates that. So a lot of my claims are going to be geared toward that. When I mention the term atheist in a lot of my arguments and what I'm going to say, I'm talking about that kind of atheist, the strong atheist, the atheist who asserts there isn't a God. I'm not talking about the weak atheist. And I want to say that I feel like I've been studying God, right? The concept of, or the being of God, the reality of God, who God is. I feel like I've been studying God since almost for like 10 years now, as of the time of this recording, and even a little bit before that, right? So to me, I recognize that God is a very complicated being, right? It is not easy to know him or to understand him more deeply. In fact, many times I felt like the more I learned about God, I felt like the less I knew, right? So, because he's so difficult to understand, he's so expansive and just beyond human understanding, right? What we know about God is only going to be as much as a human could hope to know, right? Or we hope to know as much as a human could hope to know. I don't expect that it's possible for me to fully understand God, right? So I say that to say that for the weak, a lot of what I'm going to say, I wouldn't apply to the weak atheist for that reason, right? Because God is complicated. I do not expect anyone to just wake up one day and start knowing everything about God, right? You have to really dedicate yourself to studying him and understanding him and things like that. And the more I've learned about God, a lot of it really was just already in the Bible, right? But the Bible doesn't really present the information to you like in that way. You still have to go through the work and effort to know God, right? But like I said, for me, in my relationship with God and knowing God, studying him, speaking to God, I feel like now I'm just like, oh, so much of what the Bible said was already true, right? And I didn't know that before having a relationship with God. But I say all of that to say that one of the things I've noticed growing up and pretty much my whole life is I've noticed that people look at atheist arguments in a very particular way, which I never did my entire life. So actually, before I get into it, I want to say that I don't think I even knew that atheists existed until, if I had to guess, I'd say about 9 years old. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing around 9 is when I think I first knew there was a such thing as atheist. That was amazing to me. I'm like, there's people who don't believe in God? That was like the strangest thing to me. I didn't even know that was possible, right? Because to me, it was always so obvious that God existed. Now, I didn't know who God was, what he wanted from us, things like that, but I definitely believed there was a God. I think it's obvious that there's a God. I think it's kind of, even when I was like 9, I thought it was kind of absurd to even question it, right? That's nonsense. How could anyone possibly think there isn't a God, right? But apparently there are people that do, right? So that was always amazing to me. It's always been like a mystery to me. How could someone possibly be an atheist? It doesn't make any sense. I've always felt that way. And it's always been strange to me, a very strange thing, that people sort of look at atheists and sort of take them seriously, right? So, and when I say that, I just mean, like, my whole life, I've never for 1 second thought that maybe an atheist had it right, or I can understand their arguments. They've never made sense to me. I've always thought they were complete nonsense, even at 9, right? Or when I was younger. And I've never taken them seriously, not for a second, right? I always thought, like I said, I think I've repeated myself, I always thought what they said was nonsense. And I thought it was obvious that it was nonsense, right? And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, doesn't everyone think that? But it's like, no, there are people who actually sort of will listen to them, their arguments, and they'll say, like, some people will come to belief that, like, okay, well, or they might be convinced, right, by their arguments, which is unbelievable to me. But they might hear an argument from an atheist and say, okay, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And that kind of throws them off the trail, right, from them seeking a relationship with God, which is a horrible thing. That's terrible, right? But there are people who do that, right? They'll hear their arguments and think maybe they sound more scientific or more rational, right? Like I said, I've never heard an atheist argument and thought that for a single second, right? So that's why I want to make these videos. I want to make these videos for, even though, like I said, the bulk of how you know God and how you recognize that the arguments don't make any sense is from what I talk about later, I still want to approach it even from this perspective, even from the argument perspective. So I want people who maybe take atheists seriously or think maybe their ideas make some sense or whatever. I'm going to show you, right? Hopefully. Now, I don't have all the answers, and even with everything, like I said, all the experiences I've had with God and things like that, I still don't know everything, right? So there's still questions I have, maybe even contradictions in my beliefs. No problem, right? But I argue that the foundation of belief that I have makes way more sense than an atheist and has way less contradictions, right? So I want to kind of show that a lot of the arguments from atheists don't make any sense. And when you see that, hopefully, that gives you like a stronger core and foundation to have as you pursue a relationship with God, right? Because when you hear in the back of your mind all these arguments from atheists and you think maybe, and they tell you they're more logical or more rational or more scientific, like, I want to show you that they aren't, right? I think the opposite. In fact, I've always thought this. I thought the more rational, the more scientific, and the more logical argument is that God exists. I think you have to be, how do I want to word this? I don't want to be insulting. I think not believing God is fundamentally anti-intellectual. I think it's anti-scientific. And I think, honestly, it's really just lazy, right? So, and the reason I say that is because when I say I don't really understand how anyone could be an atheist, that's not because, like, I've never spoken to them. I've even debated them. In fact, usually it's on Reddit, right? I've debated a lot of atheists, right? Because I've never been able to understand them since I've been a kid, right? And so, when I was a kid, I thought atheism didn't make any sense. Even at that level of understanding, I feel like I could come up with an argument for why their ideas don't make any sense. Which at that age, it most likely would have been cosmological argument, or first cause argument, or teleological argument, which is argument from design. So probably I would have had those at that age. But even still, like, I feel like there's no angle you can look at it from where atheism makes sense. So it would have been that angle at that age, but as I got older and I got more sophisticated and I heard more atheist arguments and I kind of could think about things more deeply, and then I started having spiritual experiences. So that was about 10 years ago when I started to know God and things like that. Atheism has made less and less and less. I'm going up it has made exponentially less and less and less and less sense, or has been more irrational to me, right? It's not like when I gained more information, I was like, okay, now I can no, that never happened, right? It's like atheism has made it's become more and more and more and more and more and more irrational to me as I've gotten older, and it's never gone in a negative direction, like where it has been, for a moment it was less irrational. No, it's always been irrational to me, and just exponentially more so, right? So that's why I say I don't know how anyone takes them seriously, but I started debating them, as I got older. I started debating atheists online, and I'm like, how could you guys believe what you believe? So I've debated so many of them. And what I notice is that atheists, they come up with these same arguments over and over and over and over and over and over again. I've debated them and been presented with these same arguments so much that when I started debating them, I started actually telling them, like, okay, I'm going to say this, and you're going to say that, and I'm going to say this, and you're going to... I can make the arguments for them in advance. I already know what they're going to say. They always say the same thing. And it's funny, that happened 2 times, and that's what actually happened, right? They actually came up with the exact arguments I said they would. Because I know, I've heard their arguments so much. What I notice about atheists is they never come up with any new arguments. I've never heard of like a new interesting argument from atheists since debating them. They always come up with the exact same ones over and over and over again, right? And to me, they don't make any sense. I show that to them in my debates with them. They may not believe it, right? But I think I show that they don't make any sense. And I never leave understanding how they can believe what they believe. I'm like, I clearly shown you the holes, the faults in your logic, right? And they just go on believing it anyway. And so what I actually came to recognize from all those debates, and I didn't believe this before debating them, right? I just didn't know. But after having debated them, I now gained a little bit of insight into what makes a person atheist, right? How it's possible. And in my opinion, majority of the time, it just boils down to a form of laziness, right? And there are different types of lazy. You could be very hardworking in one way and lazy in another, right? So some people are very hardworking physically, right? But they're lazy with kind of, like some people will work a lot of jobs, but they're kind of lazy when it comes to planning, right? And kind of investing in the future and things like that. So there's different types of laziness. Because some people will say, oh, what about the people, because they used to always tell me this, what about the people who, spent all their lives searching for God and never found him and then came to the conclusion there's no God? You're saying that people who didn't try to search for God, that's why they didn't find him. And I'm like, no. And we'll get into some of that in later videos. But I'm like, no. So you could be hardworking in that way, but you can still be lazy, right? And when I realized from debating a lot of them, and I remember the debate, I still remember it, where there was something this guy said as an atheist that didn't make any sense. I shown that it didn't make any sense, but he still insisted. And I was like, now I get it, right? What atheists do is, now knowing God is complex, right? Like I said, it's a lot of work. It's an investment. It takes effort. This is why I don't begrudge weak atheists who will say, oh, I don't know anything about God, right? It's the hard atheists who claim to have done all the research, right? God, it takes a lot of effort. It is difficult to understand God. And what atheists do is they say, man, it's hard to know God. You know what? I'm just going to say, put God in this box, say he has to be this in order to exist. And oh, look, I didn't see all these things I just made up in my head, therefore he can't exist. There's a laziness to it, right? There's an appeal to this need, to this effort to feel like you understand things. So you want to put all these phenomena and these anomalies in these boxes so that you feel like you have a nice grip on reality. Now, when you're presented with how those boxes don't make any sense, you kind of dismiss it in certain ways because you want to maintain that feeling like you're in the know, right? Because if you have to recognize you don't know something, well, now you got to do all this work to figure it out. If you're lazy and you don't feel like doing that work, you'll just dismiss it like, that didn't happen, this didn't happen, that person was delusional, that person was hallucinating, or something like that. That's what they always do, right? And we're going to talk about that in the videos. So, like I said, from debating so many of them, I've come to the conclusion that which made more sense to me because I was never like that when it came to God. I was never lazy. I'm not human, right? So I'm not gonna pretend I didn't have lazy moments throughout my life. But I never had them with God. I was always sort of ready to put in whatever work was needed to know who God is. I never was lazy about it. And I then realized that, there are people who are lazy about it, who are just who don't want to do the work. And because they're so lazy, they want to put in all these ideas and all these labels to try to justify that laziness. And that's what atheists do. They'll say, this is more scientific and this is more rational, which it's not, right? But they want to put that label on it so that their laziness seems more justified, right? They always do that. So that's pretty much it. So that's why I want to make these videos. I want people to hear these arguments and to recognize that atheist arguments are anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, and mostly they're made from a what's the word I'm looking for? A desire, right? They're made from a desire to be lazy, right? Or a characteristic of laziness, right? Now, like I said, I don't have all the answers, and there are different reasons to be an atheist too, which we're going to talk about those. But in my experience, that's what I think is usually the case. It's usually just a form of laziness, right? And like I said, I ended up debating so many of them that I just ended up stopping. There was just no point in doing it anymore because they always come with the same arguments. There's never any new arguments. I say the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. With every new debate I'd have with an atheist, it would always repeat the exact same cycle as all the ones before. And there's just no point, because there's a closed-mindedness to atheists because they're not actually seeking truth. We'll talk more about it later, but a lot of times what they're actually wanting to do is put themselves in an intellectual position of superiority or an intellectual position of knowing, right? That's their goal. The goal was never actually seeking truth. That's why nothing I say makes any difference to them, right? And that's not to say I have all the answers, so if they didn't listen to me, then it must not be true. But from my perspective, nothing they're saying makes sense, and the only way to explain it is that they're lazy, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think I covered everything I wanted to say. So in the next chapter, I'm going to talk about what I call evil deity fallacy. I was thinking about not putting that in. That's not like the most important part of atheist beliefs, but I'm still going to include it because sometimes you might hear that argument from atheists too. So yeah, that's pretty much it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.